So, I'm going to talk about why I will not give up, which is a topic that is interesting because I was originally asked about why I had not given up on the election by a very smart friend of mine who's a good liberal. And I thought about it for about 3 days because I thought it was a legitimate question. And I realized that my feelings weren't really just about the election. They were about the whole process going back to 2016. They were about all of us being defamed by Hillary Clinton. They were about the whole process of the news media trying to propagandize, to censor, to cripple us. And then they were about the actual process of the campaign. I put all that together into an essay, Why I Will Not Give Up, which was in my newsletter. It has so far been printed by Newsweek, by Newsmax, by the Washington Times, by a number of other places. You can find it at Gingrich 360, and by the end of today, you'll also be able to find a podcast on why I will not give up, in which I just read the whole thing for those people who prefer to listen, when you're driving your car, or if you have friends who like to listen to podcasts. So let me start with where we are. I think the central crisis of the American system is so big that we can't even come to grips with it, and the deliberate effort of the news media / internet system, and I lump them all together. I think YouTube, Facebook, Twitter are all like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CBS, NBC, ABC. They're all part of the same left-wing establishment that is more pro-Chinese, unwilling to be honest with the American people. It's ironic that the Washington Post has democracy dies in darkness, and yet they've become a major provider of the darkness. And so, I think this is sinking in with the average American. I think the respect for the news media is pretty close to an all-time low. Somebody just wrote in and said, how do we win the battle of public opinion? We're losing momentum. Well, I'm not sure that that's totally true. I mean, you win the battle of public opinion by constant repetition, by talk radio, by Fox News, by Newsmax, by a variety of ways of dealing with reaching out to people. And frankly, you win it in part by people who talk to people. Remember, the original Trump victory was in many ways a victory of everyday people against the establishment. And it's because people got on, their email accounts, they got on LinkedIn, or they got on Facebook, or they got on Twitter, and they just got on the telephone, or they talked at work or at church or when their family got together. And somehow this all sort of became a popular movement. I mean, part of what I'm offended by, and I think historians will look back and think was an enormous mistake by the establishment, despite everything that was done for 4 years to defame, undermine, and smear President Trump, over 74 million Americans voted for him. And if those of us who believe the election was rigged are right, it was probably substantially more than 74 million, because so much of it was really inappropriate and was not counted. We just don't know. And if you watch the way the courts have behaved, we're not going to know by any traditional pattern. So I started with the assumption that if after all of that, 74 million plus people voted for him, at a minimum, the elites ought to slow down and pay attention and say, gee, what is it we're doing so wrong that despite every effort to discredit President Trump, 74 million people repudiated us and stayed with him? I think that's a very, very important question. And candidly, if he had had even 20% fairness in the media, I suspect he would have won in a landslide, because it took an all-out effort at every level to stop him. So somebody said, how do you shut down or stop propaganda? Well, you do it two ways. One is you ignore it personally. Don't buy the newspaper. Don't watch NBC News or CBS News. That hurts with their advertising ratings. Second, you take them head on every time they lie. You go at them every time that they're dishonest. You take them on every time they fail to cover something. And you do it in part by communicating to your own friends and your own neighbors. Create your own podcast. I mean, if we had 100 million citizens, each out there talking about what they believe, a good example is this whole absurdity with Congressman Swalwell. Here's a congressman from California who apparently had a long relationship with a Chinese communist spy, sufficiently inappropriate that the FBI both briefed him and apparently briefed Speaker Pelosi. And the more I've looked at this case, because as Speaker of the House, I appointed people to the Intelligence Committee. I understand that part of the business. I wonder what Swalwell had on Pelosi to get her to do this, because it's crazy. I mean, if somebody comes in, if the FBI comes in and says, this guy's judgment is so terrible that he just spent a series of years dealing with a Chinese spy, you don't put him on the Intelligence Committee, and now she doesn't want to take him off the Intelligence Committee. And the Republican leader McCarthy has been exactly right in pushing this. So here's a good example. If we all set out to make sure that every person we knew understood how sick the Chinese penetration of the system is, how absurd it is to have a congressman on the Intelligence Committee, and particularly those of you who are living in Democratic districts, I think it would be very powerful if you would go out and on your own make sure that the Democrat in that district knows they're going to pay a price. I mean, the Democrats are faced, if we get through all of this, and I'll talk about a little bit some of the options, if we do in the end up with a President Biden, and that this is not going to be decided till the 6th, 7th, or 8th of January at the earliest. If that does happen, the Democrats in the House are faced with a nightmare, because when Bill Clinton won, 2 years later, we won 54 seats, and for the first time since in 40 years, we were in charge of the House. It had not happened for 40 years. When Obama won 2 years later, John Boehner did even better. We picked up 63 seats. So there have got to be 20, 30, 40 Democrats sitting out there who realize that they got targets on their back. And every one of those Democrats should be asked every day, what are you going to do about having somebody with ties to a Chinese communist spy sitting on the Intelligence Committee? And they should be made to feel that this isn't just Pelosi's problem. They are supporting Pelosi. They are tolerating somebody who had ties to a Chinese communist spy serving on the Intelligence Committee. So that's part of what we need to do. And that's a good example of offsetting propaganda. The news media may not want to cover it initially. I mean, somebody should organize a website and start gathering petitions to kick this guy off the Intelligence Committee, so that in every district there's an opportunity for people to sign up and say, yeah, I don't want the Chinese communist having congressmen they influence serve on the Intelligence Committee. So that would be an example. And if enough people signed the petitions, it would start making, despite themselves, the national media would have to start covering him. Somebody said, what can we do to help our president? Well, one, you ought to pray for him. This guy's under enormous pressure. He has been in a running fight now for over 5 years. He has the entire national media opposed to him. He has these big internet companies opposed to him. He has billionaires who are pro-Chinese opposed to him. This is a tough business. And prayer helps. Second, I think you can communicate with your local state legislator, your local congressman, that you're still in support of the president. And you can speak out and I think we have to learn to be at least as noisy as AOC, who, by the way, had a terrible week got beaten so badly, I think 46-13, in a secret ballot about whether or not to put her on the Energy and Commerce Committee. You say, why don't Democrats ever have to pay a price for what they do? Well, they do pay prices. They lost the presidency in 1980, and we kept it for 12 years. They lost the Congress in 94, and we kept that for 12 years. They lost the presidency again in 2000. We kept it for 8 years. They lost the Congress again in 2010, and we kept it for 8 years. So they do pay some prices. And I think, frankly, we just need to be very clear. I mean, one way to do this is to tie the word Democrat. Why are the House Democrats, not just Pelosi, why are the House Democrats tolerating one of their members who had a relationship with the Chinese Communist spy serving on the Intelligence Committee? Why are the House Democrats willing to destroy small business in order to try to get money to their government bureaucratic union allies? And I think the more we put it that way, Democrats will pay a bigger price. Somebody else said, I'm frustrated. It feels like the GOP is doing nothing. Well, I'll tell you, from a Georgia perspective, and the Georgia 2 runoffs for the Senate are the most important runoffs in American history. They will decide whether Mitch McConnell and Republicans temper any possible shift to the left, or whether Schumer and Pelosi work together to maximize the shift to the left. So these two elections are really important. And I can report to you, because I've done a lot of work in Georgia, talked to a lot of people. We have a tremendous effort underway in Georgia. And you can go to Win Red and donate money. You can help. But I think you should not kid yourself. We've made huge progress in Georgia since the election. And we have people who are now fighting mad, and they're deeply involved in trying to win these races. I should also say that I think Kevin McCarthy and the House Republicans deserve some credit, because they went out, they recruited really well, they got great candidates, and what was supposed to have been, according to the so-called experts, a 15-seat pickup for the Democrats was turned around and became, in fact, I think it's going to end up being an 11, 12, or 13-seat pickup for the Republicans. That's a swing of 23 or 24 seats. That happened because, actually it's a swing, I guess, of 26 or 28 seats. Excuse me, that happened because they had recruited really well, and because McCarthy had produced a commitment to America that was a very positive message and that contrasted nicely. And so we have the most women members the Republican House has ever had. We have the most minority members the Republican House has ever had. And we're positioned pretty well to keep growing in 2022. So I think it's not totally fair to talk about, why do they feel like the GOP is doing nothing? I'm also asked the question, do the American people have the stomach to fight? Oh, I think so. I think despite, and you see a little bit in what just happened, despite every effort of the elite media, despite every effort of the internet-based system, despite billionaires like Zuckerberg putting in $400 million to rent governments. That's what he was renting governments, which has to be illegal. Despite all of that, 74 million Americans stood up and voted for Donald J. Trump. Now that's an act of defiance, and I think you're going to see more acts of that kind. I was asked the question, how can we be assured there will not be fraud in Georgia? You can't be. Secretary of State has been so terrible. Raffensperger is just unbelievably bad. And I think he's intimidated, apparently, by Stacey Abrams, the Democratic leader. Some of the things he's done make no sense to me. And look, I've been active in Georgia politics since 1960. I have a fairly long track record. And I'm appalled at some of the stuff he's tolerated. On the other hand, I can tell you that the campaigns are totally committed. The Republican National Committee is totally committed. The state party is totally committed. The senatorial committee is totally committed. I mean, there are more people in there today who have greater knowledge about stopping theft than we ever dreamed of, and they're taking it really deeply. I'm asked a question about the Hunter Biden investigation and the fact that Attorney General Barr said there was no need for, I think he said there was no need for a special counsel. He didn't say there was no need for an investigation. And I want to just say, you know, I've known Attorney General Barr for a long time. I knew him back when Bush won, when he was in his early 40s and he was already Attorney General at a very young age. I thought it was an act of real citizenship on his part to come out of retirement. He didn't need to do it, agree to be Attorney General again. I think overall he's done a good job. People criticize him, but overall he's done a good job. And the point he's making is one which a lot of people feel, and frankly I feel this way. We have regular processes. We have U.S. attorneys. We have ways of going after these people. I have never liked special counsels because a special counsel in the end feels like they've got to get somebody. And I've watched them at times abuse their power. You just saw it in a sense with what happened to General Flynn, which was terrible. One of the worst abuses of an American citizen. Guy serves 33 years in the United States uniform, the U.S. Army, risks his life and gets treated like this. It was just a scandal. We did 2 podcasts with General Flynn, and if you haven't heard them, I recommend really go to Gingrich 360 and check out those 2 podcasts. You'll be very impressed with what a remarkable man he is. What else can we do besides contacting our legislatures? Well, first of all, contacting your legislatures, contacting your senator, and contacting, by legislature I mean the state senate and the state house representatives in your state. Then contact your congressman and contact your senators. That's a huge step in the right direction. And I think keep making noise. How do we stop government overreach? That's going to be one of the biggest issues the next few years. I have personally been appalled at how many of these governors in particular, mayors, county commissioners also, particularly the liberals, have just gone crazy. I mean, Lord Acton warned years in the 19th century that power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. He dropped the word tends. Well, when you see what some of these people, the governor of Michigan, the governor of Nevada, the governor of New York, I mean, some of these people are just petty tyrants. And I think they're violating the Constitution. And of course, we're starting to see the Supreme Court come in and say, yeah, you can't say it's okay to have a casino, but it's not okay to have a church, to give you an example. So I think that we're going to have a huge fight shrinking government. Trump was making substantial progress in getting government to be smaller and less intrusive, and that's part of why they went crazy trying to beat him. He represented the end of their world. Remember, Pelosi was willing to block all help to small business in a desperate effort to get hundreds of billions of dollars for the government employee unions, because those are the allies of the Democratic Party. And I think that you have to recognize that they are driven by this need to take care of their government, their union members, including the teachers' unions, which have clearly operated much more as unions rather than educators. Finally, how can we require voter ID in all states? I think that it's very important that an honest election movement start next year, and that we will have, I think, 23 or 24 states where Republicans will control the House, the Senate, and the governorship. We ought to start there, and then we ought to make it a major campaign issue in 22. So everywhere we should try in every single state to get 4 or 5 specific breakthroughs to get to an honest election. One of them would be voter ID. You have to prove who you are, and you have to vote in such a way that we can connect you to your ballot, so you don't end up in the kind of nonsense where suddenly, 50,000 votes show up. We have no idea where they came from, that sort of thing, which is just an invitation to theft and an invitation to corruption. So I wanted to give you this brief overview. I hope you'll take a few minutes, go to Gingrich 360, take a look at the article, and then if you would, get a copy of the podcast, which will be out later on today. I also want to invite all of you, while we're having this moment, to take a serious look at the Inner Circle. It's a place where I try to brief people 4 or 5 times a week, and we keep ideas going, and it's right there at Gingrich 360. And I really appreciate you tuning in and giving me this opportunity to share ideas with you. Thank you very, very much.